All right. So thank you all for joining us today. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Mike Talbot. I'm Notre Dame's Director for Initiatives in Mexico. We're glad that you could join us for this session of the Mexico Virtual Lecture Series, which is presented by Notre Dame's Mexico Global Center. The usual Zoom meetings rules apply. Please keep your microphone on mute so that we don't have too much disruption. Feel free to turn your camera on. It's nice to see faces, but obviously you don't have to. If you have questions, please submit them via the chat. I'll monitor those, and Dr. Miller-Graff and Martinez Tortella will respond to them with the time at the end of their presentation. So let me just very briefly provide introductions for our speakers, and then we'll jump right in. Dr. Laura Miller-Graff is an associate professor of psychology and peace studies at Notre Dame. Her research examines the developmental effects of exposure to violence during childhood, with a focus on children who have had multiple traumatic exposures. She investigates resulting patterns of resilience and psychopathology, including the development of post-traumatic stress symptoms. Working within an ecological framework, Dr. Miller-Graff's research seeks to understand how various systems interact to promote or inhibit healthful development following violence exposures. She has a particular interest in the adaptation and evaluation of trauma assessment and treatment in low and middle income countries and conflict-affected settings. We are also excited to have with us today Dr. Cecilia Martinez Tortella, who is an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at the Universidad de Monterrey and member of the National System of Investigators, SNE. She received her PhD in clinical psychology from Michigan State University. Her research addresses the mental health impacts of interpersonal violence on women and their children, as well as individual, family, and environmental factors that amplify risk or promote resilience. In addition to her collaboration and work with Notre Dame, she is also collaborating with the Nuevo León Women's Institute and the University of Memphis. So with that very brief, very cursory introduction, I'm going to hand over the floor to Dr. Miller-Graff and Dr. Martinez Tortella, and look forward to hearing about their work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction, Mike. And we're really excited to be with you all here today and to share a little bit about our work. We've divided the presentation roughly in half, so I'll start with a little bit of background and information on the Pregnant Moms Empowerment Program development in the US. And then I will turn it over to Dr. Martinez Tortella, who will speak a little bit more about the adaptation and some of the preliminary evaluation data that are coming out of our project in Monterrey. Okay, great. Make sure I can advance. Here we go. Okay. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the term intimate partner violence refers to physical, sexual, or psychological abuse by a current or former partner. And 1 in 3 women globally experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime, making it the most prevalent type of gender-based violence in the world. The prenatal period and the perinatal period, so the time around women giving childbirth, is a time of heightened risk for intimate partner violence. So it's of particular concern, both because we see this heightened risk, but also because, we see that when women are pregnant, there are particular risks conferred on the next generation as well. So I will talk about those in a moment. For all women who experience IPV, there are some common mental health effects. So women who experience IPV experience higher rates of depression and post-traumatic stress. For women who experience IPV during their pregnancy, the rates or the prevalence of clinically significant symptoms of depression ranges between 15 and 79%. Pretty wide range, I know, but varies quite a bit depending on the study and the population. And clinically significant post-traumatic stress ranges from 7 to 53%. We also see that IPV during pregnancy is associated with increased risk to physical health for women and for infants. So we see higher rates of, for example, labor and delivery problems for women who have experienced IPV. We also see that IPV in the prenatal period affects women's parenting. So for women who have experienced IPV anytime in their lifetime, we see an increased use of punitive discipline, lower levels of engagement with their children, reports of reduced empathy, and higher levels of aggressive behaviors. For women who experience prenatal IPV, we see reduced what's called maternal sensitivity. So that's mother's ability to notice and effectively and quickly respond to their children's needs. We see that women who have IPV exposure have more rigid expectations of children, report lower levels of acceptance, and also have some more difficult maternal representations of their children. So fears and worries projected into the future about their children's lives. For their children, we also see that if their mothers were exposed to IPV in pregnancy, there are higher rates of social, emotional, and behavioral difficulties, as well as more insecure attachment. So drawing all of these things together, we actually see that, these aren't just isolated kind of IPV leads to this, right, or that, or the other thing. They actually are all kind of related to one another in a broader ecosystem of how we understand the mother-child and the family relationship. So this is a study that I did with some colleagues a couple of years ago that looks at the cascading effects of prenatal interpersonal physical violence. So you can see here, and maybe I can get see if I can get my little, I don't know if it's gonna work, okay. Prenatal interpersonal physical violence is associated with maternal depression at 6 months postpartum, which is in turn associated with mother's warm responsiveness, so that ability to sensitively respond to their children at 8 months postpartum, which is in turn associated with children's aggression towards parents and towards peers at 2 years of age. So you can see, right, we see some really long and sustained effects, but those effects really unfold through an intergenerational cascade that includes a lot of these processes in a complex way. So when we think about all of the challenges that women who have experienced IPV might confront, our research group turned to look at what psychological interventions were available for addressing the effects of IPV in pregnancy. Now, there's a number of programs that address, for example, specific mental health domains, right? Treatments for depression, treatments for post-traumatic stress. There are also a number of effective programs for IPV-exposed women with older children or IPV-exposed women in general. But what we saw when we did a review of the literature of IPV programs for pregnant women specifically is that programs delivered during the perinatal period really had challenges demonstrating broad and lasting effects for women and for their children. And a lot of these programs really didn't include a broad focus on all of the different key developmental issues for pregnant women that I just mentioned, right? So labor, delivery, perinatal health, parenting, depression, post-traumatic stress, violence, re-victimization. And really, when we saw that in the literature, we saw a clear need for these programs to address a broader array of issues, and it kind of girded our hypothesis that maybe this is what was explaining the relatively weak effectiveness of some of these programs, is that they weren't really targeting some of the most salient developmental issues for women. So out of that review and a number of other studies that we did, my colleague Katie Howell and I, she's at the University of Memphis, adapted a program called the Moms Empowerment Program. So the Moms Empowerment Program is a program for women who have older children and who have also experienced IPV. And we thought that this program was well suited for targeting those diverse array of domains, and we worked on adapting it for the perinatal period. We had a few kind of key undergirding theoretical frameworks, which I won't spend too much time on now, but I'm happy to spend more detailed time on it in the Q&A if it's of interest. But essentially, we delivered the treatment in 2 modules. So sessions 1, 2, and 3 were really focused on establishing safety, so doing safety planning and violence prevention work, and helping women identify and understand, sources of stress and how to cope with challenging experiences emotionally and otherwise that are associated with IPV. The second module of the program really focused on perinatal health, infant care, and positive parenting. We talked about everything from, how you talk about the fact that you have a partner who is violent with your healthcare providers to, how you can support your children and find positive family role models for them and caregiving supports after labor and delivery. So this program we then piloted in the context of a study. It's a group therapy program. And again, I'm happy to talk more about why we do it as a group, but we really believe that the group process here is particularly important for women. So groups included 4 to 6 pregnant women. They met once a week for 5 weeks, and then we assessed them 5 times so that we could track both the effects of the program on them as well as on their infants over time. So we assessed women at immediate pre-test and post-test, so right before and after they had done their intervention, or for the control group at the beginning and then 6 weeks later. And then we followed up with all the women and their infants at 3 months and 12 months postpartum. This is just a little bit about the information about the composition of our sample here in the United States. In our pilot study, we had 137 pregnant women ranging between 17 and 41 years old. I think one thing to note about this sample is that the level of IPV exposure is really very high. So our average was women reporting 168 incidents of violence in the past year. So really, quite significant exposure. On average, women were about halfway through their pregnancy, although we had a pretty substantial variation on that. And as you can see, we had a racially and ethnically pretty diverse sample as well. This is just a little bit of information about what we call study flow. So one of the things that we care about in long-term research is making sure that we are following up with people who successfully over time, because if we see that there are patterns in how people leave our study or don't return, then that can affect our interpretation of the results. So we want to see, for example, that not all of the women who had depression dropped out of the study, right? Otherwise, that would cause us to interpret our findings relative to depression differently. So I will note this now, and I'll come back to it at the end. We actually had no meaningful patterns in study dropout at the post-test or at the 12-month follow-up, but we did at time 3. So I'll talk a little bit more at the end about how that influences what we found. Some of the key findings from the study, we had a number of findings that kind of spanned across the course of time. So we saw for women who participated in the Pregnant Moms program as compared to those who were in the control group, they reported lower levels of sexual and physical IPV at every time point of assessment. So an immediate post-test as well as sustained out to 3 months and 12 months postpartum, which we were really excited to see. We also saw at 3 months and 12 months postpartum that women in the treatment group were reporting lower levels of IPV-related injuries. In terms of mental health, we saw lower levels of depression reported at both the immediate post-test, and you can see the D there. Those are the statistics of effect size. So it basically gives us a sense of the magnitude, small, medium, and large, so we can get some barometer of the impact of the program. So at post-test, our impact was in the large range. At 12 months postpartum, it was in the medium to large range. We also saw, in terms of parenting, that women who participated in the Pregnant Moms program reported higher levels of parental empathy at the immediate post-test, higher levels of developmentally appropriate expectations, so understanding what children could do at different ages and having those align with their parental expectations of them. And then at the 12-month postpartum follow-up, we also saw that women reported higher levels of parenting confidence. So this is essentially their sense of self-efficacy about, their parenting behaviors. So do they feel like they're good parents? Do they feel capable when they're parenting? So this is also a long-term effect we were really excited about. Now you'll see here, right, relative to time 2 and time 4, we have fewer significant effects at time 3. So this is where I think the differential, what we call differential attrition, right, the patterned effect of people leaving the study really mattered. So what we saw at the 3 months postpartum interview is that women who were more highly exposed to IPV were the least likely to come in for that particular assessment. And that kind of makes sense to us, right? Because 3 months postpartum is a tumultuous time anyway for families. There's lots of adjustment. It's really challenging to get out the door with a 12-week-old baby, especially so for women who are currently experiencing a lot of significant interpersonal and environmental stress. But it does mean, and we think a lot of our lack of effects at that time point might be driven by the fact that we do have that patterned attrition. So really, we kind of look to the immediate follow-up and long-term follow-up as kind of the most instructive domains. In terms of implications, we really thought that these findings showed the promise of integrating those parent and mental health components for women who had experienced IPV. And we were also really excited to see that even what is a very brief program, 5 sessions prenatally, had a relatively sustained effect. And I think it's important to note that we're not thinking of this program as a panacea, as everything that women need. We regularly refer women to other services, and we really think about this program as part of a network of supports for women. But we were really excited that this appears to be a meaningful contribution to this network. So after this work, we began to have some conversations with Dr. Martinez-Tortella on thinking through the relevance and the adaptability of this kind of a framework or approach for other contexts. So I will go ahead and stop there, and I will turn it over to her.
Thank you, Laura. And thank you for the invitation to be here. I am excited to be able to share more about the work we've been doing in Mexico. If you just bear with me for a second, because I have to get us back on track with our slides. Excellent. So we began these conversations, as Dr. Miller-Graf was mentioning, thinking about how many of the characteristics of the PMEP program were well suited for a context that is characterized by very high levels of IPV, as I will mention in a second, as well as significant barriers to care. Right. So the most recent statistics show that about 26% of women report experiencing IPV in the past year, and 44% report lifetime victimization. And this is higher than that sort of worldwide average that Laura shared with us. There's also significant risk for IPV during pregnancy. And very significantly, the large majority of women who have been exposed to IPV do not seek help from formal sources. And this means reporting it to the police, going to a hospital or clinic to receive care, seeking out psychological services or social work services. And some of the common barriers to care that have been discussed in previous research include women's fear of the consequences, and these might include repercussions from partner, but also can include what's going to happen to their children, what's going to happen to their extended family, or what kind of reaction their extended family is going to have towards them, thinking about strong stigma against single mothers or women who seek becoming separated from a partner. There are also feelings of shame not knowing where to ask for help or how to ask for help, not knowing what resources are available, but also being afraid of approaching the resources that they know. So in different studies that ask women about sharing their situation with medical staff during a clinic visit or reporting to the police, women reported that they perceive these actors as unhelpful at best and abusive at worst. And so many women shared experiences of re-victimization when sharing or seeking out help from doctors, nurses, or police. And so thinking that PMED being a manualized intervention with good empirical and theoretical support that is short-term, relatively low resource in terms of the training that's required from facilitators as well as material resources, we began this process of cultural adaptation. First, we established a partnership with the state's Women's Institute. So I am in, or UDAM, where my institution, we are in the state of Nuevo León, which has one of the largest metropolitan areas in Mexico, the Monterrey and adjacent municipalities metropolitan area. And the Women's Institute is the largest provider of IPV related services. And so they provide free of charge legal, psychological, and social work services to women who've experienced gender violence, as well as a variety of other prevention services, education services, etc. Throughout this partnership, we conducted focus groups to collect information from potential participants. And so these would be women who were being served at the Women's Institute who had been exposed to violence during a pregnancy, as well as pregnant women from economically vulnerable regions of Nuevo León who were attending a health clinic. We also interviewed service providers. And again, through the partnership with the Women's Institute, we interviewed their mental health providers. And we also reached out and were able to get information from OBGYN service providers and trainees from a local hospital. And based on these interviews, we identified barriers to care and specific needs of our local population. So based on all this information, we were able to, in addition to completing a translation of the materials, which was conducted and reviewed by native speakers, myself, as well as Mexican students involved in my team, we were also able to develop content and process-oriented modifications to the manual. Right. And so we conducted qualitative analysis of these interviews and these focus groups with women and service providers. And we organized the information in different level of barriers. And so thinking of interpersonal barriers, women talked about hopelessness and helplessness, not being aware of what IPV is or being in denial of experiencing IPV, seeing this as something that happens to other people, shame, as well as this feeling of being silent and the expectation that they will remain silent. In terms of structural barriers, women talked about common barriers that we might hear related to access to services, including childcare, economic difficulties, transportation difficulties, but also they talked about the importance of knowing about their legal rights and what they were entitled to, the importance of knowing more about pregnancy and family planning or sexual health, and the need for health literacy and advocacy. In terms of family expectations and power structures, women talked about distrust or discouragement about accessing helping systems. So both women and providers talked about how networks might discourage women from seeking help. Partner coercive control is a barrier to seek out support. Monitoring by partners' family members, either because they were living in the same household or through conversations and interaction, trying to find out where the women is spending their time and reporting this to the partner. They also talked about how women are expected to be dedicated to their family and spouse. Also about this concept that the violence and adversity is the women's cross to bear, and that they should bear it without complaint. There was also discussion of seeing the baby as a blessing that was going to come and change the relationship and make things better, as well as different cultural stigma. One of them I alluded to before, this idea that being a single mother or being a woman who has children and does not have a partner is very difficult, is very negative, and that they will never find a suitable partner in the future. And there was also discussion of widespread violence exposure. So women having difficulties traveling independently because of community violence and crime, as well as instances of medical abuse and intergenerational violence against women, which normalized IPV. We have all this information, and as we are thinking through this and having discussions as a team, we found that many of these components were already integrated into the PMIP program. And so during the program, women have conversations about what constitutes IPV. Women talk about how they can make changes in their life. We talk about very practical things that they might do to start helping them become more activated and feel less helpless or hopeless. We provide education about pregnancy. We provide education about their medical, sort of the different health, their checkups and all the health information that they will need for their delivery. There's also a lot of emphasis on helping women accessing additional supports, like Laura was mentioning, information about referrals, but also informal supports, helping women mobilize their networks. There's information about the normalization of IPV and intergenerational patterns of abuse. But we also saw that there might be things that are specific to this context that could be addressed through additional modification. And so the elements that I have highlighted here in the italics, like lack of childcare, importance about the knowledge about the process and laws in Mexico that can protect them against partner violence, information about family planning, were things that we included either in process or content adaptations. And so we were going through this process when the COVID pandemic hit and changed everything about how we provide care. And so we began with a virtual implementation, and we're still doing everything in our project in Mexico virtually. And this was a response to the COVID pandemic, but also is helpful in addressing transportation issues. During our interviews, women talked about the difficulties. The metropolitan area of Monterrey is very large. It can take more than an hour to go from one place to another. It can take even longer in public transportation. Women who are pregnant may not feel comfortable using public transportation. And so the virtual implementation actually does help us with a lot of those limitations. Because of the virtual implementation, but also issues related to childcare, we found that 1 hour sessions were more feasible for women, that they may be able to keep their children entertained at home for an hour, have someone help them with childcare during that period of time. Or we also have women who are at work and said, I'm going to ask for a break during my work, and I'm going to receive permission to do this, but it's impossible for me to join a session for 2 hours. And so our format is that we have sessions, 60-minute sessions twice per week. We do everything for the assessments via phone, and we conduct our sessions via Zoom. And so women often access these through their phones, and many of them do have access to Wi-Fi. But those women who don't have access to Wi-Fi they receive a data phone card. So pretty much we provide them with this card, and so they will have additional data on their phone that they can use to be able to attend the sessions. We also included additional visual and video resources Particularly the service providers that we spoke with talked about how women respond really well to video and visual information. There were literacy concerns, and also in terms of the women's ability to remain engaged in these virtual sessions, we found that the visual and video materials are really helpful. In terms of content, we included additional information about women's legal rights, specifically the legislation related to the right to a life free of violence, information about the right to receive orders of protection, and many times we also refer them to the legal services that are provided free of charge at the Women's Institute, as well as other legal rights. We also include information about family planning, as well as discussions that focus very specifically on the intersection between machismo, being that Mexico is still a culture, as a culture, we still are carrying this tradition of machismo and large gender disparities in terms of access to rights and how this intersects with violence. And so we began the implementation of this adapted manual and a pilot evaluation. And so for this process, we again are partnering with the State Women's Institute. We train two facilitators who are psychologists who have vast experience working with women exposed to violence. And we began recruitment locally in the Monterrey metropolitan area through partnerships with local agencies that provide violence and pregnancy-related services. However, we found that in part because of the COVID pandemic, we were encountering many challenges recruiting women through these agencies. Many of these agencies were sort of historically providing these services face-to-face, and during the COVID pandemic really had to cut back on the amount of services they were able to provide, and they were providing all services via distance, for example, over the phone. We also found that many women were not really willing to talk about violence when they were sort of asked by providers. So we are partnering with one or a number of health clinics. We visit different health clinics each week through the Ministry of Health here in Nuevo León. And we find that women who are approached by our staff are fairly reluctant to discuss violence-related topics, which again, we try to present these in a very non-threatening manner. We talk about generally sort of what the program is about, that if they're interested in participating, they might complete a initial online survey to verify their eligibility. And we found that women are relatively reluctant to do this. And so the most successful strategy that we found is social media. And we were lucky to receive additional funding so that we can expand our recruitment. And now we have a national strategy through social media where women see our ad. If they're interested, they can complete this initial online intake form. And after that, we're in contact with them via messaging as well as telephone to complete additional elements of the study. And so in terms of, again, sort of the flow of the study, we begin with this online screening or phone screening. After these, women complete a telephone baseline assessment where we assess a number of different dimensions. Women are randomized to either the PMEP group intervention or a control group where they can be referred to other psychological services. After the group, we complete a second or post-intervention phone assessment. And we do the same with the control women. They did not participate in the intervention, but after about 6 to 7 weeks, we complete their second telephone assessment. We remain in touch with our participants monthly to confirm they're interested in continuing to participate in the study. We also invite them to be part of a Facebook page where we share information about pregnancy, coping, etc. And then we complete our final assessment when the babies are 3 months. And so as of now, we have enrolled 65 women in the study. who have been randomized to either the intervention or the control groups. We have completed 3 iterations of the group, and we have 2 ongoing groups. In fact, one of them just began today. And so 17 women have completed, or 17 women who were randomized to the intervention have completed the groups. And we were able to complete their 2-time interview with 16 of these women. 20 of the 34 women who are part of the control group should already have completed their T2 assessment. And we've had 13 of these women complete that phone assessment. Who are participants? So I'm going to share information with you about the 29 women who have completed our T2 assessments. Women were on average 29 years. About 38% of them were first-time mothers. They were about midway through their pregnancy as well. Only a minority, about 35%, live with a partner. About 48% have a less than high school education. About 62% define themselves as being low socioeconomic status. Only about 35% are employed full or part-time or independently through informal employment. And about 35% of women told us that they are not employed and not seeking employment. And interestingly, about 45% of our participants reported that they have received some mental health services during the past year. During our T2 assessment, the women who participate in the intervention, so as of now we have 15 women who have done this, provide feedback about how was the program for them. And so women provide us with different suggestions, including longer or more sessions, individual sessions, and more psychological supports, including a partner, or more focus or discussion on partner relationships. A couple of women talked about difficulty scheduling, and this is a difficulty that we have noticed and have been trying to address. It's hard to get 5 to 7 women who all are able to participate at the same time, and then pregnant women may have different kinds of appointments that they can't miss or reschedule, like medical appointments. And one woman suggested that we include more discussion about IPV. Women also provide a lot of positive feedback for the program. All of the women said they would recommend the program to other pregnant women. We asked them what were the most useful aspects of the program, but then we asked were there aspects that were less helpful, like what were the aspects that were at least helpful for you? And 100% of women reported that all the aspects of the program were helpful. In terms of the most useful aspects, they talked about the information that was shared and learning about violence, pregnancy, baby care, etc. Women also highlighted that being part of this group, feeling supported by both the facilitators, but also other pregnant women, this being a trusting space where they could share their experiences, was something that was very helpful to them. Women also talked about how the program helped them build their self-confidence as mothers, that it really helped them see what they were capable of doing. And some women connected this to listening to other women's experiences and sort of feeling empowered as women, hearing how all of them have been navigating very difficult situations and managing to get themselves and their families, their children, the baby that's on the way, making sure that everyone's okay. And women also talked about the importance of the stress management tools that they were learning, and how the group being a space to talk about their feelings is something they really appreciated. In terms of the outcomes that we were expecting to see, we are finding that IPV was decreased for both groups. So at our T2 assessment, women who participated in the group were experiencing reduced levels of IPV, but this was also true for the control group. And here you can see that both of the lines, are fairly similar in terms of their trajectory. We also measured women's levels of depression at T1 and T2, and we find that both groups reported significant decreases in depression. So in the graph on the left side, you can see that the control group is the blue line and the intervention group is the greenish line. And so as you might be able to see, the intervention group does have a steeper decline than the control group, but we also have higher levels of depression for women in the intervention group at T1. We also looked at clinical rates of depression. And so women complete this questionnaire, they obtain a score, and we have a cutoff that we can use to estimate which women are likely experiencing clinical rates of depression. And so when we do that, we find that the clinical rates of depression decrease only in the intervention group. So if you look at the graph on the right side, the control group is in blue, and we see that the percentage of women with clinical depression remained fairly constant, around 58%, versus in the intervention group, we see a significant decline from 81% of women to 31% of women experiencing clinical rates of depression. For PTSD, we also see decreases for both groups. On the left side, you might see that the intervention group, the green line, has a steeper decline than the control group. But this difference is not yet significant. Again, we have a relatively small sample of 29 women. And we did not see significant differences in the clinical rates of PTSD. Again, for the intervention group, we do see that 50% of the women were experiencing clinical rates of PTSD at T1, and these reduced to 25% by T2. But these results are not yet statistically significant. And finally, we asked women about their pregnancy stress. We asked them, when you think about your pregnancy, how do you feel? And so from very stressed to very relaxed, we find that women who participate in the intervention report significant decreases in pregnancy-related stress, but women in the control group did not experience this decrease. So I would like to close talking a little bit about our lessons learned and future work. And so we are very excited to continue to run this intervention, to complete our pilot evaluation and be able to evaluate parenting and infant outcomes and see what's happening when these women are 3 months postpartum. How are their parenting attitudes? What's happening with their babies? How's the baby development going? However, we also, in terms of lesson learned, we are thinking through addressing some of the challenges we've been finding. And so in terms of recruitment, we have found that it's important for us to provide education about what constitutes IPV, even as we're asking women these questions about whether they have experienced IPV. And so as part of our screening, our online screening, we include this graphic on the right side of the screen where we talk a little bit about instances of violence that might not be as clear-cut to women, right? When we ask about violence, women frequently say, no, my partner does not hit me. But it's important for us to communicate to them the wide variety of experiences that constitute violence and help them acknowledge and realize if they are experiencing these problems in their relationship. As I mentioned before, we are now enrolling women from all of Mexico in our study, and this is very exciting. And this has been very interesting also to see in the confirmation of groups, women come together from different states throughout Mexico. However, as Laura mentioned, PMEP is one piece of the puzzle, right? It's one element in a network of services for women. And so we have experienced some challenges when trying to be very purposeful in referring women to services in other states wherein we are not as familiar with the services that are offered. So we are working on trying to establish some of those relationships with agencies in other parts of Mexico. For example, we have been in conversations and we've been able to talk some with the Women's Hospital in Puebla, which has been helping with our recruitment and can also be an ally when we're thinking about referring women to other local services. And then last, we are seeing difficulties retaining our women who are part of the control group. So in our experience, the women who participate in the intervention are very connected to the program. They feel very grateful with their peers, with the facilitators, and they are very willing to complete their interviews. On the other hand, women who participate in the control group, they complete their first interview and then we try to interview them again 6 to 7 weeks later. And many of these women have very chaotic lives. They are very busy. They might have work, other children. They might be experiencing current partner violence. And so it's been hard to get them to complete these interviews. And we are continuing to use different strategies to try and address this problem. And so last, I would like to thank our funding sources that have made this work possible, our community partners. Here are just a number of the partners that we've worked most closely with in Monterrey and the state of Nuevo León, participating women, as well as a team of researchers and staff who've made this collaboration possible. Thank you for your time and attention as well.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. Thank you very much, Laura. What fascinating and important work this is. A reminder to everyone that you're welcome to enter any questions you might have into the chat. I'll get us started with the moderator's privilege of a few questions. And maybe starting with those that are centered around COVID and how that influenced this study. 2 points come to mind. One is what we read about as a general increase in IPV during lockdown and COVID generally, not just the proximity, but difficulty reporting, increased pressures and stressors. How you think that might have influenced this study and IPV generally. And then specifically about the program in Mexico, I think it was wonderful that the shift to virtual, like you said, creates access, helps with transportation. I presume it's part of the reason that you're now able to do this across the country. But I worry about confidentiality if people are joining from their homes, especially if they're living with their partner who has caused this IPV, or even the family expectations that you referenced to. How do you accommodate or handle that? You don't know who's next to them and not on screen, or who's in the house. So those are the 2 questions I ask for you both to start.
I can start, or if you were going to jump in, Laura, go ahead. So in terms of the first question, partner violence and COVID. So we definitely saw, in terms of official reporting, the New Orleans Women's Institute keeps statistics, and there was some reporting of increased IPV. I think not just in Nuevo León, I think all of Mexico and all over the world, there's been a lot of discussion about the difficulties that COVID brought in terms of being home, not having that possibility of being away from a partner, aggressive partner, the difficulties accessing services. But it also increased the availability of remote services. So in some ways, at least at the Women's Institute, there was new ways of interacting for women, right? And so WhatsApp texting services became more prevalent, and this is something that was not offered in the past. For example, also emergency hotlines became, by the Women's Institute, they increased the number and availability of workers that were available to provide those kinds of services. And so even though we do think COVID has definitely highlighted and worsened many of the factors that come to bear for partner violence, stress in the home, economic difficulties, becoming isolated from possible social supports. There's been some response by different agencies trying to make services more easily available to women, which I do think is very welcome.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that, I completely agree with and echo everything Cecilia shared. You know, we did collect some data here throughout the pandemic, you know, on women's experiences of shelter in place and IPV. And one of the things, and I will say this is anecdotal because we haven't, you know, looked at the actual kind of metrics as they lay out. But one of the things that we notice is that shelter in place, when, you know, everybody was under stay-at-home orders, could have been very protective or placed women at a lot of risk, depending on whether or not they were actually living with their violent partner. So for many women whose violent partners did not live in the home, shelter in place actually prevented their partner from seeing them on a regular basis for a period of time and enabled them to access, as Cecilia mentioned, some of the virtual supports that were newly available. On the other hand, right, if you were sheltering in place with a partner who is actively violent, you know, not only did that violence also, you know, sometimes increase in intensity, but as you mentioned, Mike, you know, then services also, even though they might be available, could also be challenging to access for privacy and safety reasons.
Also, anecdotally, one of the partners we work with, the fact they offer shelter services for vulnerable pregnant women. So they're not specifically a violence exclusive service, but many of the women who are sheltering there who are pregnant have experienced violence. And they mentioned women's sort of reluctance to coming to the shelter, at least at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, because of fears of not being able to isolate from and quarantine from other people. So they talked about how I think this has changed quite a bit, and we are now in a very different situation, and we have been in a very different situation for at least 1 year. But at the very beginning of the pandemic, women becoming nervous of accessing those really kind of crisis emergency services because of fear of becoming infected. The second, I'm sorry, go ahead, Mike.
No, go, please.
I was just going to say the second question about how do we handle confidentiality issues. I think it's a really important one, and one that we have thought about quite a bit. And so we have some protocols in place. So women are provided with headphones so that others in their surroundings can hear what other women are commenting. They are asked to be in a private space and to have their camera on, so that we can see if someone is coming into their space. Not every woman is able to do that. So we've had women who are connecting to their phone, to Zoom using sort of the phone option. And so it's impossible for them to turn on a camera, but we try. And we have a very lengthy discussion at the beginning about safety and confidentiality and why it is important to follow these guidelines. We also have a safe word that women can use that they together come up with at the beginning of the first session, where we talk about guidelines and rules and what we want this group to look like, that they can use if somebody comes into their space and they would like for us to sort of change the topic. And they also know that they can just log out of group at any time if they feel like they need to do that, or that somebody could be overhearing or their safety is at risk. the facilitators are sort of very vigilant of also trying to make sure to protect this. So if they were to see that someone is in the background close by, they would ask the woman to go to a breakout room and try to sort of troubleshoot to make sure that that the privacy is maintained. But it's definitely something that that we think very, very carefully about, because these women can be in very precarious situations.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear there's so many steps being taken. We're almost at an hour, so I'm going to ask one last question before thanking you. This is really an invitation to both of you to explain the advantages. Laura alluded to this, and I think Cecilia, maybe some of your answers that you already gave about the feedback here in Mexico probably respond as well. The advantages of these interventions in a group setting versus directly just one-on-one. It seems to be the case that the benefits are exponential, or at least significant enough that they warrant it. So could you please explain a little bit about what the mechanism there what mechanism is taking place that offers those benefits?
Yeah, I can speak to this, and Cecilia, obviously, I welcome your thoughts as well. I mean, I think there's three key benefits that I can see from our work. So one is that, it's well documented in the research literature that women who have experienced IPV are more socially isolated. And in part, that's because of the control that their partner might exert over their social relationships, right? And so I think the experience, particularly for women who have experienced IPV, of coming to a group and being with other women is really important. I also think, what we see in the groups is we see women who are in all parts of their relationship with their partner, right? So you have some women who are living with a violent partner, some women who have left the violent partner, some women who had a violent partner and now have a new violent partner. And really, I think the conversation and the exchange between women is really useful for feeling heard, but also really motivating change. And women are, in a lot of ways, right, the best advocates and supports for other women in their group. They know how to navigate these systems, right? And I think part of our philosophy, when we facilitate these groups, is really for the leaders to provide some important information, but really to kind of hand it over to the women as much as possible to kind of discuss these topics. And our role is really, to provide kind of the infrastructure and the venue, but really for women to kind of make it what they want. And then I would say the third reason, an important reason, and this is especially true here in the United States in ways that it's not in every context, but the providers of mental health care are very different racially, demographically, than many of the women receiving these services. And so I think being careful to, make sure that women feel respected and heard, and that the processes in group are really equitable, is also a dynamic that I think the groups provide.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything that Laura said. I will say that it has been one of the elements that has required a shift of paradigm here in Mexico. I think culturally, the model for mental health is individual therapy. I think very few people have experience with sort of a group setting for mental health. And so women at first are a little sort of surprised to hear that this is a group intervention. And towards the end, as I mentioned, many of them comment on how it was so helpful to have these other women during their closing session. When they're saying goodbye, they talk about all they learned from their peers. And so I think both for providers, so when we talk about this project to different institutions, as for women, it's taken a little bit of a shift in mindset, and it's been a little bit of a labor of really experimenting and giving this group modality a chance. And I think we're seeing positive results. And at the same time, women have the opportunity to participate in individual therapy, individual psychological supports if they so decide. So it's not the case that if someone's participating in PMEP Mexico, they cannot be receiving individual therapy or other individual supports.
Thank you. So Laura, Cecilia, I see that we have a question from Deanna. I'm assuming you're okay, you have time if you're willing. So Deanna, would you please unmute and go ahead and ask your question?
Hi guys. So firstly, sorry if there's a lot of background. There's a lot of noise in the background, but I'm just the cafeteria at school. So firstly, I just wanted to thank you guys for all the research that you're doing because I think it's amazing and I'm truly passionate about this whole topic. I'm also Mexican, so very biased about this. And besides like thanking you again for doing all of this, I just wanted to ask you maybe more of advice on where to find all these references. I'm currently working on intimate partner violence research, specifically in Mexican women, and I'm utilizing, for example, the one of INEGI surveys, the household survey, but the last one was conducted in 2016. So I was wondering if you guys would have like any advice on where I could find more information on this and get more statistics. But thank you.
I can say, Diana, I presented information about that same survey, the 2016, because there was a 2020 version of that same survey of the household dynamics, but it doesn't come out until later this year. And so for sort of a national census statistic that's updated, you are going to have to wait. I can't remember if it was something like July when I went into the page and I was looking to see when the 2020 would be published. It wasn't going to be until later this year. So in terms of sort of those national statistics, I think 2016 is the most updated information that we have. I'm happy to also share with you specific sources from some of the work that I've done in terms of finding out the state of the art in Mexico. If you would like that, you can share or we can connect somehow. I don't know if Mike can provide me with your email or we can connect somehow, but I'm happy to provide some of the information I found that's a little bit more related to service utilization.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. That would be super helpful. Yes, I think, yeah.
I should have your email from the registration, so I can connect you. Great.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. This is super helpful.
Wonderful. Well, a final thank you to Laura and Cecilia. Their appreciation as well in the chat. One more question, if you have time. Just came in. So thank you. Truly appreciated it. Question is, what are the chances of this program, research, expanding to the rest of Mexico? This questioner is from Zacatecas and would love to see a program operating there. So are there, as part of this expansion, plans to access Zacatecas as well? So
as of now, women who live in Zacatecas can enroll and participate in the virtual intervention. So what I could do, and again, I'm sorry, Mike, to give you more work, is to share our recruitment flyer. So as of now, the way that we are distributing our recruitment flyer, as I mentioned, we have distributed it here to different organizations in Mexico, but we're also just using Facebook. And so women from all over the country see the ad on Facebook and they register if they're interested. But if someone at your specific institution will be interested in disseminating this, we can share the flyer. And if you share with women, they can participate as easily as just going into the link or using the QR code. They enter their information, and if they meet the criteria, and the criteria being they're pregnant, they've experienced violence, they're less than 32 weeks pregnant, just because if they are to advance in their pregnancy, they typically are not able to finish the program. They can participate in this intervention virtually, right? Even while being in Zacatecas. So if again, Mike put me in contact with Elizabeth.
Absolutely. So I've put my, for Elizabeth, for Diana, I've put the email for the Mexico City office. It's just mexicocity@nd.edu in the chat. If the two of you or anyone else wants to email that, I'll be sure to get it and I'll put you in connection with Cecilia. Sound good? Oh, and Cecilia just
Or
shared
you
hers,
could
so you can
just
do it directly.
email me directly so we don't give more work to Mike. I'm sorry
All right.
about that.
No.
But yeah, I just thought it's probably easier if you just email me, and I'm happy to
Perfect.
provide you with the flyer and the material that women could use to enroll in the program.
So thank you, Laura. Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you to everyone that joined. A really important and interesting presentation. Hopefully some of these connections will create opportunities and support networks for women. So thank you all, and I hope everyone has a good rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great day.